Lori Rustina. I'm an associate professor of law here and the director of the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems. And I wanted to welcome you to this very special evening tonight. At Vermont Law School, we don't just train lawyers, we teach folks to be advocates. And today we have the pleasure of hosting two people, Will Allen and Vandana Shiva, who exemplify how advocates can scale up social movements by linking action to international advocacy. This is how we can make positive change that crosses nations and oceans and lifts up people and the environment. I first met Will Allen on his farm, Cedar Circle, a model of small, diversified, economically and environmentally sustainable agriculture, not too long ago. But I can tell you this, I believe Will Allen has lived many lives rolled into one. He holds a PhD in anthropology, taught agriculture and anthropology at the University of Illinois and UC Santa Barbara, and served in the Marine Corps between the Korean and Vietnam Wars. His book, The War on Bugs, documents the shift to industrial chemical agriculture in the United States. He was fired from his tenure-track professorship for his involvement in the civil rights and anti-war activism. He's an expert on organic cotton farming and a founder of the Sustainable Cotton Project and Farms Not Arms. His Cedar Circle farm in nearby Thetford, Vermont, is a key member of the VT Right to Know Coalition. Will Allen reminds me to do this, never stop. Please warmly welcome Dr. Will Allen.
Well, give yourself a hand because the reason we were able to pass the labeling bill is because of all of you. I mean, when we went to the legislator said many of them got 1,500 letters, emails, and phone calls from all of you. And there's no possible way we would have been able to do that without you. And we were able to form a coalition because everybody played a really important part, and we kept this coalition together for 3 years, which is remarkable for coalitions. And we're still close friends, and we, try to help organize things like this because we know that even though we passed the bill in our legislature, it now is in the courts, and we're being sued by, some of the biggest corporations in the world, and we feel like, well, we have a good chance to win, but we also know that the courts are fickle and they're, generally not in favor of regulation. And so we have a fight ahead of us, and that fight is going to require your assistance again, because we need to keep the volume up on this struggle. And tonight is an illustration that you want to keep this volume up on this struggle. And, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking here, but I do want to emphasize that, the things that Vandana Shiva talks about are that we should start realizing that the corporatization of so much of our culture, has taken over our agriculture, our military, our rivers, and all of our resources, and exploited them however they wanted to. And it's not like GMOs is an isolated case that we can separate out from the rest of what's happening in the world. I mean, this is all of the stuff is related. And one of the things that Vandana is able to do that very few people are able to do is synthesize all of these problems and bring you to a center so that you see, oh, this problem is very similar to that problem. This problem is impacting on this other problem and actually causing it in many cases. And so I think it's really important that we realize that, we have in our midst one of the really powerful women in the world. One of the most powerful women in the world, because she speaks truth to power. speaks truth to power, and it completely freaks him out. I have to say that it completely freaks him out. She won the Right Livelihood Award, and right away Monsanto came up and gave her the Bullshit Award, which is a plank of wood with cow shit on it. And saying that, well, she was preventing the poor from eating by depriving them of genetically modified food. And so every time she gives a presentation, somebody is going to come up and give her trouble. There could be somebody sitting in the audience tonight, like there was last night, who came up at the end of the question period and challenged her. Not so much challenged her, challenged the audience to think that she was either a fool or a liar. And so that could happen tonight. It happens a lot of times where she is, because people that she is going after are afraid of her. So we were fortunate, my wife Kate and I, to go to India and try to help Vandana out with the problem that she had, which was in 2000 we found out that 20,000 Indian cotton farmers had committed suicide because they'd gotten in debt, sometimes in the neighborhood of $800. And so they would commit suicide because they were going to lose that piece of land. Or they would sell their kidneys into the international organ market. So she asked us to come over and testify with a lot of other international activists about this crisis. And we were, had studied cotton a lot, so we knew a lot about cotton, and we knew that we didn't need to use the chemicals, we didn't need to use GMOs. We were getting high yields, high quality, and more money for our cotton than the chemical guys were and the GMO guys were. Right? So then, 20,000 people in 2000. Now, 300,000 Indian farmers have committed, cotton farmers have committed suicide. And when you look at that, that's so bizarre. There's only 40,000 cotton farmers in all of the United States. Only 40,000 cotton farmers in all of the United States. So that's the contrast here. And it's still an international issue that we have to deal with. It's like a similar issue to what happened in Bhopal, India, when a chemical plant blew up and methyl isocyanate was released into the atmosphere. And this is a crisis that we're dealing with right now. And there's several other crises that Vandana is going to talk about and try to pull together into a picture that you can see and that we can actually work on. We actually need to work on these issues that can't depend on Vandana to take care of all of this. We're responsible for this. It's our corporations that are going over and doing this. And if we don't step up and say something, if we don't step up and do something, we don't put our bodies on the line, who else is going to? And who else is going to? And basically what we're talking about is, we're talking about how are we going to keep an agriculture on this planet that is sustainable, that our grandkids can use. Right now, we're destroying so much of our agriculture because these fools that are running these corporations are only interested in profit. They're really not interested in feeding the world. They're not interested in feeding the poor, even though that's one of their big arguments. So try to listen tonight for how you can enter this struggle. Try to listen tonight for how you can make a difference in your communities. And you've already made a difference in Vermont. The whole world is looking at us because of this law that we passed. This little tiny mouse of Vermont roared, and the corporations are really looking at it. So let me just say one more thing before I introduce Vandana, and that is that, we have a sign-up table over here for the Vermont Right to Know Coalition, and we'd like to have you, sign up and so that you can be on our mailing list. And the other thing I want you to know is the Vermont Law School. This is a treasure. We're so lucky in Vermont to have this law school. And we're so lucky to have the ENRLC, which is the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Clinic. And during our struggle They joined our coalition in the second year of our struggle, and they were instrumental in helping us refine the law, refine the bill, and work with lawyers around the country. So please try to involve yourself in these struggles, because I've found that they're really a lot of fun. I mean, even when you're in jail, you're going to have a good time. I mean, and I've got a lot of experience in that. So, I mean, like, you know, you're going to be in jail with some of the best people in the world because they actually give a shit. You know, and so that's what we want you to do. And so, like, you know, please welcome Vandana Shiva. She's just a fabulous person and a great friend of mine.
Thank you so much, Will. Thank you to the law school. I've come all the way to congratulate this law school. I want to thank also my dear friend Jean and my son for allowing me to come, because I should have been having a holiday with them at this point. What you've done here in Vermont and what the law school has done is, in our times, 2014, absolutely path-breaking. It's path-breaking because it starts to bring sanity into a totally insane legal system, where legal constructs like corporations claim personhood. And claiming personhood, they claim free speech. And they don't just claim free speech, they claim intellects and intellectual property and property in products of the mind. There is no mind out there. There is no person. And that's why this case is so important. Both the efforts you put into getting a law passed on the right to know, as well as what's going to come in the future. I've spent all my time since 1984 first looking at industrial agriculture, triggered by the Bhopal disaster 30 years ago, triggered by the explosion of extremism in the state of Punjab in India. Punjab means the 5 rivers, and it's bountiful state, rich in soil, rich in water, rich in hard-working farmers. And yet, by the 80s, it was literally a land of violence. A lot of the violence was triggered by the anger of the farming community. In effect, it was a peasant revolt. And the farmers of Punjab were putting out declarations saying, you know, when you can't choose what you grow, you can't choose how you grow it, you can't decide its price, you can't decide when the water from your rivers will be released, then you're living under conditions of slavery. Because the Green Revolution was applied to the state of Punjab. And the Green Revolution is the name given to industrial agriculture when it comes to the third world. It's not green, it's not revolutionary. It's just recycling war chemicals in the name of increasing food production. And that's what I found when I started to look at agriculture more closely. So where do these chemicals come from? Why are we using the pesticides that kill people in Bhopal? Why are you using so much chemicals and fertilizers that get farmers into debt, especially when the subsidies get withdrawn? And that's when I realized that industrial agriculture, of which the latest phase is GMOs, basically comes from the war. The chemicals designed for the war. Chemical fertilizers are designed in factories that made explosives. So if you notice, Oklahoma bombing, it was a fertilizer bomb. Oslo bombing, a fertilizer bomb. Indian High Court bombing in Delhi, fertilizer bomb. Every bomb in Afghanistan, a fertilizer bomb. Because the CIA put out so much chemical fertilizer thinking somehow they counter the Soviets. And now that all that fertilizer is available to make explosives. And the early pesticides, and the War on Bugs is, in my view, one of the best books to become familiar with how poisons became normalized in agriculture. And I love the title because that's the mentality. Not only are the chemicals from warfare, the mind of applying these in agriculture is a mind frame of war. Every insect is an enemy that must be exterminated. Every green plant that emerges, which is responsible for so much nutrition, called a weed. There are no pests in nature. There are no weeds in nature. They're insects and voluntary crops. And I remember in my childhood, one of my favorite foods was something my grandmother would cook, which was a voluntary crop in the fields of wheat. We call it batwa, I think you call it lamb's quarters. It is delicious. You can make raita out of it, a yogurt. You can mix it in flour and make chapati. You can make a green, a sag. You have free batwa or free amaranth greens, and we did a study, 250 varieties of amaranth grow in the fields to provide you all your vitamin A and all your iron. There'll never be scarcity. So when you treat them as enemies to be exterminated and you spray herbicides, then you create nutritional scarcity. And that mindset of warfare has continued. It's continued through the period of the introduction of the Green Revolution in India, but now through the introduction of GMOs in agriculture. We're always told without GMOs the world won't be fed. We were told without chemicals the world won't be fed. But chemicals destroyed the biodiversity and thus destroyed nutrition. In fact, biodiverse farms of the kind we promote through Navdanya in India produce far more nutrition per acre, and that's what we measure. Because it's pointless to measure a nutritionally empty yield. I call it Descartes' ultimate victory. That food has been reduced to mass and yield, when it should be experienced through its quality, its nourishment, its taste. And sadly, industrial agriculture has actually reduced availability of nutrition, both by destroying the nutrition in the soil from where the nutrition first comes, reducing the diversity, shrinking agriculture to monocultures, and then transforming those monocultures into non-food. We've traveled, we've visited Will and Kate's farm, we visited the Intervale farm in Burlington. We've also seen the corn monocultures. But that corn is not a food system for humans. It's going to animal feed. And animal stomachs were designed to be able to eat lots of roughage. That's why herbivores have 4 stomachs. And that's why they're called herbivores, like grass. So we're dealing with a system that isn't a food system. Producing nourishment is not its objective. Producing nourishment is not what it's doing. It's producing commodities for trade and profits. And the figures are so clear. 30% of the food that humans eat comes from large-scale industrial farms. 70% in spite of a whole century in North America and half a century in our parts of the world to promote industrial agriculture. In spite of that, 70% food comes from small farms and family farms. If all of that destruction hadn't happened, it would be 100% of our food. And we wouldn't be having to deal with having to have GMO labeling laws, because food would be true food. For a while I used to say we should call whatever stuff is being produced non-food. And then I realized, no, it's worse, it's anti-food. Because non-food would not harm us. Anti-food is starting to become the biggest threat to our health as well as the planet's health. Let me just run through figures for you. And I'm giving you United Nations figures from treaties that the United Nations has evolved. 75% of all biodiversity in farming had disappeared because of industrial monocultures in 1995. That's before GMO monocultures. That's before all of Argentina was one green desert of Roundup Ready soya. Before the Amazon was being chopped down for Roundup Ready soya. I was taken by Marina Silva, who was the environment minister at that time, to see from the air all of the illegal deforestation that Cargill was engaged in to grow the soya, which was Monsanto's soya, and then illegally export it down the river. We gave the bishop who was fighting for the indigenous people a Gandhi Award, like we'd given it earlier to Arpad Putsai and the farmer from Saskatchewan, Percy Smizer, who was sued after they had contaminated his crop. They actually had killed a nun in the Amazon before that for trying to prevent the deforestation. I think her name was Sister Dorothy, if I can remember right. So you've really got a system that is an anti-food system based on the mentality of warfare and instruments of war. And of course it cannot make peace with the earth. It cannot nourish democracy and people's rights. Because the significance of the case here in Vermont is that all the democratic rights of people and citizens enshrined in the Constitution are now being treated as illegitimate, that need to be washed away, because a whole new set of rights is being constructed. Rights of fictitious personhood. And, you know, I do a lot of thinking about knowledge, I do a lot of thinking about what's real and what's not real. And I do feel one of the biggest threats to human survival is abstract constructions being given rights. Because that means that real beings, the species on the earth, real people, who through struggles over decades and centuries have secured rights, those rights stop being counted. And the very fact that the corporations who are challenging the Vermont law say in their challenge that labeling of GMOs is a complete ban on speech. Well, it's an exercise of the freedom of citizens to know what's in their food and to be able to make choices on the basis of that knowledge. That is a fundamental right. That is the basis of free speech. Not the ability of corporations to withhold information, to destroy the democratic rights of citizens and people. So the case that you are at the heart of is, in effect, addressing three very, very big issues that are of relevance worldwide, not just to Vermont. They're of relevance to the United States, because outside Vermont, people really do believe that corporations have personhood. And a lot of money is being spent to make that illusion take root. But besides the illusion of corporate personhood, there are two other illusions at stake, which your efforts, your movement, the law, and the response to that, challenges to that law, are dealing with. One is the false narrative that industrial agriculture feeds the world. And embedded within it, the false narrative that GMOs feed the world. So I gave you the figures of the biodiversity destruction. Water, 75%, soil, 75%. And I wrote a whole book called Soil Not Oil, tracking the contributions of different sectors to the contribution of greenhouse gases. And agriculture is the single biggest contributor in terms of industrial farming, whereas ecological agriculture and biodiversity and intensifying the recycling of carbon, intensifying biomass production, intensifying biodiversity are the single biggest solution. But they aren't a solution only because soils absorb carbon when you recycle organic matter. They're a solution because the only way we will be able to do the damages of climate change in terms of droughts and floods, because soils rich in carbon are water reservoirs. And that allows you to face the climate extremes that are coming. 2009, we had a very severe and very extended drought in India. And I traveled to all our members, because we work in about 17 states of the country, to help farmers save seeds, to help them grow organic, and then help them with fair trade systems. And in spite of the drought, the farmers who were using local seeds and doing organic had a crop. And the farmers who were waiting to get enough irrigation to grow chemically farmed rice, which is the Green Revolution varieties, they had bare fields. They had nothing. Now, when they talk of so-called high-yielding varieties, they never tell you how badly they'll fail in the bad years. Now, one of the clauses in the challenges to your GMO labeling law is, the industry says, one way to raise plant varieties that have been genetically modified through biotechnology to be more productive and more easily adaptable to changing conditions. False. Genetic engineering does not increase yields of crops. It cannot increase yields of crops because it's a tool to introduce genes from an unrelated organism. That's all it is. It adds unrelated genes. The yield comes from the original plant into which these new genes are introduced. One of the very false impressions created is there were farmers who bred, and then we did scientific industrial breeding, and now there's genetic engineering, and we are more accurate, we are faster. No. In one season, a good farmer can see the best crop in their field, in one season, and do a selection. 15 years and 15 million is what it takes. to get a genetically engineered crop to the market. We could use that money much, much better by having farmers doing their breeding or by having public breeding. Second, very clever tool that's now being used is, there's nothing new. This is how, it's GMO, it's genetic modification, and we've been tweaking genes all along. So there's nothing new. No, we never tweaked genes. We worked with plants as co-creators and co-producers, so that the intelligence of the whole plant and the intelligence of the farmer worked in total harmony to evolve new varieties. That is why we have the miracle of 200,000 varieties of rice evolved by Indian farmers from one plant, the species called Oryza sativa. From one grass. Look at what they gave us. The basmati that grows in Doon Valley, the valley where I was born, where my son was born, the valley where we've now set up a conservation farm, growing more than 1,000 to 500 varieties of crops every season, where we have a learning center, an earth university, where we work with the soil and the earth and the seed and our farmers to learn how to do good farming, how to work with the laws of the earth rather than against the laws of the earth, to work with the laws of biodiversity rather than against the laws of biodiversity, to work with the laws of the nutrient cycles that replenishes the soil's fertility rather than against those cycles, rupturing those cycles. So on the productivity front, it's a totally false claim that GMOs increase food production, therefore they are a solution to hunger in the world. Technically they can't, empirically they don't. The very good report from the United States, from the Union of Concerned Scientists, called Failure to Yield, that goes through every variety released and found there's no gain. There can't be, because the yield traits come from the original plant, into which the new genes are introduced. In India, when Monsanto came in, they used to put on their packages, you're going to get 1,500 kilograms per acre of cotton. The average has been 500, and that's dropped in the last few years to 400. And in many cases, it's zero, either because that year was a drought year, and the crops didn't do well, or it was too much rain. In any case, the GMOs are introduced into hybrids which require irrigation, and in unirrigated areas, they fail far more often. So not only is industrial agriculture not producing more food, GMOs are not contributing to increased production or increased resilience. In fact, I've been shown pictures by scientists like Don Huber of the Midwest in this year of drought, where the organic field of corn is doing fine and the GMO corn is finished. There's nothing there. So it has no adaptive capacity because it's been so hugely tampered with. Another fiction that was introduced into the United States as a result of the fact that beginning with about late 80s, 89, 90, the world community started to negotiate a treaty to conserve species. It's called the Convention on Biological Diversity. And my government asked me to help advise. So I asked them, I said, who are you sending as a negotiator? They said, of course, the head of Project Tiger. I said, why the Project Tiger? They said, well, that's what biodiversity is, elephants and tigers. Because wildlife conservation was all that was in the minds of governments at that time. And I explained to them. I said, this is the struggle for the green oil of the future. And the reason I could say that to my government is I've done the study on Punjab, as a result of which I'd written a book called The Violence of the Green Revolution, as a result of which I was being invited to conferences on agriculture, including one on biotechnology, 87. And the industry laid out what it wanted to do. The old chemical industry now saying they wanted control over the seed. They wanted to own the seed in order to collect royalties, but the only way they could claim this was by doing genetic engineering, because now they could say we've made something novel. They also were very honest in saying the US and Europe are not enough. The companies are all US, American and European. You know, it's Monsanto, it's Syngenta, and they said we are too small. So Syngenta was 4 companies before that. It was Ciba, Sandoz, AstraZeneca, now they're 1 company. If you look at the map of how many companies Monsanto controls, hundreds of seed companies have been bought up by them. In India, they control 60 Indian cotton companies through licensing arrangements. So there are 5 companies now, and this is what they had said. We'll be 5 by the turn of the century. And they said we can't do it in US and Europe alone because it's too small a market. The real market is the South, and for that we will need an international law, which is what they got into place through what became the World Trade Organization, rules on intellectual property. Now Monsanto went on record in 95, after the WTO was established, saying we've achieved something absolutely unprecedented. We defined a problem and we offered a solution. We wrote a law, took it to our government, took it to the GATT Secretariat, because the precursor of WTO was the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And our government then imposed it on the rest of the world. We were the patient, diagnostician, physician, all in one. So what was the problem they were defining? The problem was they said that farmers save seeds. That's a problem. And the solution is it should now be illegal for farmers to save seeds. They were defining this issue in the FAO, which was called Seed Wars. It's not fair that farmers save seeds. It's totally fair for us to have a monopoly so that we can extract super profits and super royalties, even if it means farmers get into debt and have to end their lives, as is the case with the tragedy of farmer suicides in India. Now, on the one hand, they were talking about creating life because you can't get a patent on a seed unless you've claimed you've invented the seed, because patents are only granted for inventions. Before WTO, there used to be different kinds of, the word was not intellectual property at all. There wasn't one term. You had copyright, you had design, you had trademarks, you had breeders' rights, and you had patents. And patents for industrial manufacture, for what is manufactured. And I've had lots of debates with US negotiators over these many, many years, both in the WTO setting as well as in the biodiversity setting. And they always say, no, we have to define life as a manufacture because it's the only way we can have future growth. A very, very good article in the Forbes. I would think it is November the 6th of 2012. And one pager. Why Uncle Sam loves Frankenfoods. And it's an analysis on trade, showing how on every sector the US has a negative trade balance. Only in agriculture and intellectual property rights, royalty collections, there's something come back. So, defining life as a manufacture, as an engineered product, is a huge flaw. Because life is self-organized complexity. It's not manufactured and engineered by human beings. As I said, we can co-evolve with life forms. We can modify them, but we don't create them. They're not like a machine set to put us together by different parts and we collected. There's a history, millions of years of evolution, thousands of years of farmers breeding, all the gifts of the pollinators and the sun and the soil organisms, all of that is embodied in one little seed. All of those relationships. It's not an engineered act. So while on the one hand, when it comes to owning property and creating laws of intellectual property and patenting, there's this false claim we've invented the seed, and it's new, and it's never existed before. When it comes to biosafety, the industry says, just like nature made it, at the heart of your labeling law and the challenge to it is this false assumption of substantial equivalence. Now, how did this substantial equivalence principle come to be put in place in this country? I mentioned my government asked me to help advise on biodiversity, since I'd anyway done many years of work by then and had started the movement for seed saving. And we've created more than 120 community seed banks because I believe seed is a commons. It's not private property, it's not an invention. And I started going to the negotiations. And I would not just work with my government, but I would work with other governments. Malaysian government, I would work with the Ethiopian government, would work with the Nordic, Scandinavian countries, to put in as much as we could into that treaty. One very important part of that treaty is an Article 19.3, which is on biosafety, which is the subject of your case. Article 19.3 says every government has an obligation to look at the impact of genetically engineered organisms on biodiversity. I was asked to work on an expert group to frame what this treaty would look like. It ended up being what is called the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. It's international law. Most countries abide by it. But I was in the negotiating hall in Rio when President Bush refused to sign this treaty and said, I will not affect my $50 billion biotech industry to be affected. I will not allow it. There's a very interesting scene in a film made by a very courageous French filmmaker who's also written a book called The World According to Monsanto. And in it is a scene which he's got from some TV station in the US where Senior President Bush is visiting Monsanto headquarters and is saying, just tell me what you want to do and I'll get it done. Now when you have presidents who don't regulate companies but ask companies for instruction, tell me what to do and I'll do it, you start to have this unraveling of the regulatory process. So what was worked out by industry fed to President Bush, who then told his vice president, and I can't help but smile each time that I mention this because even in India the story reached us that Dan Quayle couldn't spell potato. But then here he was spelling substantial equivalence, a much longer term than potato. And basically saying, let's pretend now onwards that a genetically engineered organism is equivalent to a non-genetically engineered organism. Not only is this totally inconsistent with the stance of the industry to say we made something new, never existed in nature, and now when it comes to safety and the rights of citizens to be protected, the rights of citizens to know, they turn around and say, just like nature made it. It's natural. The same entity cannot be natural for safety issues when it comes to responsibility of the industry with respect to the environment, with respect to public health, with respect to the impact on farmers. And that same thing becomes totally new and an invention when it comes to owning property. This is ontological schizophrenia. And there is huge ontological confusion. Not just about novel on the one hand and natural on the other for the same entity, but also on the personhood. That's an ontological problem. What exists in the world? Beings exist in the world. Beings with flesh and blood. Beings that eat food. Beings that are born and die. Corporations don't die. We do need to revisit the campaigns that were started, and we were talking about this at lunchtime today. Two very, very dear friends, Ward Morehouse and Richard Grossman, about the fact that democracy at this point of corporate rule requires a whole revival of the withdrawal of corporate charters. After all, corporations are allowed to exist as legal constructs on the basis of what society designs for itself. And if they violate fundamental laws of living, of allowing life to unfold, both the life of other species as well as human life, and if they aggravate the violation of human rights and social injustice, then it is time to have a movement for the withdrawal of their charters. They exist on the basis of our permission because they are social and legal constructs. They are not persons. And it is an idea we will have to put into place again, because it's an idea that is today the only way we can prevent ecocide and genocide on a very, very large scale. I don't know how many of you are aware that on the basis of the idea of corporate personhood, there is right now 2 free trade treaties being negotiated, one with the Pacific, one across the Atlantic. And in both, corporate personhood is being institutionalized through what are called investor-state disputes. I would basically define the challenge to the Vermont law as equivalent to those challenges. Because corporations sometimes call themselves persons, sometimes call themselves investors, sometimes call themselves the runners of elections, whatever they choose for whatever is the moment. The investor-state dispute system is corporations trying to claim rights to sue governments if governments protect the public interest. And where do they sue them? You can't sue them in a national system because the national system is defining the duty of the state as the protection of that public interest. So of course the corporations would lose. So they want to create new secretive tribunals staffed by their kind of trade negotiators to make these decisions. I'll give you 2 cases of where this has already happened. After Fukushima, the people in Germany said no more nuclear power. The Green Party won a series of elections because of Fukushima. Germany was forced to say no more nuclear power. A Swedish nuclear corporation sued Germany. So we'd have made so much money and now you're taking away those profits. There's a very famous case in the Amazon of Chevron having devastated the Ecuadorian Chevron area in the Amazon, and local people, indigenous tribes, sued. And they won the case against Chevron. Chevron is now suing the government of Ecuador to say, you pay the compensation. You pay us compensation. So in fact, the government of Ecuador has a whole campaign on dirty hands, with oil on your hands, and I try and help them as much as I can. But coming back to the ontological delusion of the same seed being novel when it comes to owning and substantially equivalent when it comes to running away from responsibility, this is what the industry has written in its challenge. Genes are heritable units of an organism that are responsible for the traits that an organism expresses. When a plant is genetically engineered, genetic material has been inserted into the genome of the plant. Inserting a new gene into the genome of a plant is changing the genome. The word substantially equivalent has no scientific meaning because you're modifying at the genetic level. At the genetic level, what you need to look at is how different is the organization of the genome. What are the new genes you added? How are they functioning within the genome? How is this transformed GMO interacting with its environment? All of that is what biosafety looks at. They're admitting they've changed the genome and inserted a gene, and then say substantially equivalent. So their challenge, their para 20 is totally inconsistent with every para where they're talking about substantial equivalence. I feel very sad that your Secretary of Agriculture is perpetuating this. The opposition from the industry is quoting Vilsack as having published in The Atlantic on May 14, 2014. He's saying the federal government requires a label on something where where there's a warning that there's a potential safety problem, or we're giving nutritional information. Labeling of GMOs don't fit either category. They fit both categories. They fit the category of potential safety because there's an international law on these issues. There's a precautionary principle. There's research that's showing indications of harm and therefore making a call for deeper investigation. The principle of substantial equivalence in this country has started to create a culture of ignorance. And through the culture of ignorance, a denial of citizen rights. Because basically you're saying, modify the gene and then don't look, pretend it's the same. A genetically engineered eggplant is like a normal eggplant. Then don't look, don't see, don't find. We were able to stop the trials, the commercialization of the GMO BT eggplant, because the dossiers submitted by Monsanto, and I have till date never seen a dossier, either from the FDA or from Monsanto in the United States. A report to the public, this is what we found. Have you ever seen a report? A thoroughly analyzed assessment of each of the GM crops? It's been done in Europe. In India, they were forced to submit because we fought cases in courts and said they have to provide this to the public. On the basis of that, we could make out organ damage is taking place in rats. But substantial equivalence says, don't look, don't find, don't see, and then say, safety proved, because you didn't look. Now, not seeing and not investigating is not proof of safety. It's evidence of ignorance of safety or hazards. And that's why this principle that is at the heart of the challenge must be scientifically challenged. And I know all of you here, both in the movement and the law school and the government, will challenge it, because that challenge will make a difference to the whole world. Whole world, because we have such laws in place, but there's an attempt by the industry to undo them. There's an attempt to undo the precautionary principle of Europe. There's an attempt to undo the biosafety law of India and put in place a self-regulation law by industry, which is the system that's here, a deregulation law. There is no law to regulate the biotechnology industry in the United States. That's why you've had to work on labeling. Because the government has failed in its duty to guarantee that what is being released commercially has been tested independently in every dimension of safety. And the dimensions of safety are so huge because everything gets impacted by a GMO. Pollinators get impacted, there are studies on that. We've done a study on soil organisms, 22% gone in 4 years of cultivation of the BT cotton. The plant itself is affected. And because evolution is about relationships and not about things, the assessment of a GMO needs to be done on the basis of its interaction. So, again, in the challenge, there's a claim that herbicide-tolerant innovation enables farmers to use herbicides to eliminate more of the weeds that compete with their crop for space and light and nutrients and water. First, of course, plants don't compete. Plants cooperate if you do the right kind of farming. And they help each other. But even if you assume that everything is competing with everything else, the claim that herbicide tolerance is reducing the problem of weeds is so countered by the evidence in this country. The problem of resistant weeds that are making agriculture so difficult and are opening the floodgate for the next generation of herbicide-tolerant crops, those resistant to 2,4-D. You're going to have new generations of evolution of the problem. So that, in fact, GMOs have created superpests. They have created superpests because they've evolved resistance through the constant pressure. That's part of the package that needs to be evaluated. Every claim of the superiority of GMOs on the basis of the scientific evaluation of the 20 years of commercialization, every claim is false. So you're on very strong grounds, very, very strong grounds to challenge this. I love the claim that the industry is making. The state is compelling manufacturers to convey messages they do not want to convey and preventing manufacturers from describing their products in terms of their choosing. No, Mr. Grocery manufacturers, you cannot choose to give junk food and GMO junk food with total freedom. After all, you accepted nutritional labeling. This is just the next step, because you're modifying food in a new way. It's the next step. And the claim of Vilsack that this has nothing to do with nutrition is so false. Because herbicide-tolerant crops, particularly Roundup-ready crops, Roundup works by what is called chelating, basically binding minerals and taking them out in the soil of circulation, so the plants can't get them, and in our gut from performing the function they perform. And now there's so much research to show that this binding of metals like manganese, iron, zinc, cobalt, magnesium is actually leading to the prevention of our gut organisms from performing their functions in creating enzymes that then contribute to brain health. And that's why the destabilization. That's why such a huge epidemic of brain-related problems. So of course the industry in its multiple attacks on me says, oh, she's not a scientist, she doesn't know how to study causation, she only knows correlation, because the graphs are going like that. But the scientists know the correlation as well as the causation. They know the processes by which Roundup-ready crops are affecting our health. And I want to congratulate again both the citizens of Vermont as well as the government and the legislator here that on these very, very far-reaching questions about whether we will treat people as people or corporations as people, whether we will recognize and study the potential harm of chemicals, poisons, and GMOs, or we will shut our eyes till more and more children have problems with their guts and intestines. More and more children are born autistic. The Center for Disease Control has shown that there's a 30% jump in autism in the last 5 years in this country. And on that rate, half of US children will be autistic by 2050. We are talking about not just potential possible problems that would happen way into the future. We are talking about things going wrong today. And you have woken up the nation. Thank you.
We have time for a question and answer session. We have 2 microphones that will be roaming. And so if you'd like to raise your hand, then the microphone will come to you. And please keep the questions brief, respectful, and question-based. Thank you. Thank you so much and for all your work and inspiration. And I just want to know what you think about the rights of nature as a possible counter and means of, as a possible solution.
Well, when corporations claim to create life forms, then rights of those life forms become the antidote. So the rights of nature is very, very much the basis of any work done on GMOs on the one hand and intellectual property rights linked to GMOs. Because the only reason, as I mentioned, GMOs were introduced was to claim ownership, right? But there is a new threat, and I think the law school should look at this. I started Navdanya because the Monsantos of the world thought they could prevent farmers from saving seeds. They didn't get too far with that, so then they started to create new laws to prevent farmers from having their own seed. Not just saving seed bought from Monsanto, but having heirloom seed. And someone gave me a high mowing organic. For me, the seed saving began with the recognition of the rights of all living beings, which is the rights of nature. And we'll have to do this work a lot because now there is an attempt to prohibit, initially with seed libraries because they're small, but there would be an attempt to shut down this because the idea is to allow no alternative. Yeah. So Pennsylvania and Maryland have had notices served by the Department of Agriculture. So you can't have local seeds. Local seeds tested and tried over hundreds of years, and in certain civilizations, thousands of years, they are the ones that are dangerous. They can lead to agri-terrorism. That is the statement made when the Pennsylvania Seed Library was being shut down. So, what we've done in India is both work on the issue of safety, which is where the labeling law is embedded, but also the rights of nature, the rights of seeds, which are nature's way of continuing life into the future, those rights. And we, if you go to the Navdanya website, Navdanya, you will find 3 reports, which I would suggest will be very useful for you. One is the law of the seed, which we've written on the basis of the instruction from nature. How does seed work? It works with diversity, not with uniformity. It works with resilience, not with vulnerability and breakdown. So that law of the seed was used to roll back the kind of laws they're trying to bring into this country that were introduced in Europe last year, and they were rolled back. There's another very interesting report. It's a global report written by scientists and citizens worldwide on GMOs, and it's called The GMO Emperor Has No Clothes. Because truly, the GMO emperor has no clothes. It is a very naked emperor. And the third is a seed freedom report, which is based on a cross-cultural reporting across the world on the rights of nature, which then become the duty to save seeds, because rights of nature call on us to protect seeds. And the pledge we take in Navdanya, our members, we take just a simple pledge. We have received these seeds from nature and our ancestors. We have to protect them in their diversity and integrity for future generations. Therefore, we cannot obey any law that violates our duty to nature and the future.
Hi, Vandana. My name's Nancy. I'm a 1L here. And first of all, I want to thank you for being a huge inspiration to me and for doing your work. I really appreciate it, 100%. My question has to do with biomass, and especially the proliferation of biomass that people really don't know about, and also as an alternative energy source to basically transition us from fossil fuels. But obviously, you're very concerned about biodiversity, and I feel that the discourse that, like, I would say the environmental movement focuses on is not talking about biodiversity. Because obviously biomass, forest biomass specifically, is a huge cause of deforestation in the world and also land grabbing in developing countries. And I'm sure you know about the UN REDD program that is essentially creating these carbon markets in third world forests. And indigenous people do not have access to the forests that they've guarded for thousands of years. And I'm very saddened that a lot of big name environmentalists are saying that biomass is a viable solution. So I would just love to hear your perspective on it, and also what we could do as law students to sort of address this problem.
So, I've learned everything I know, either from nature or from peasants, particularly peasant women. And in India, peasant women live in a biodiversity and biomass economy. Very different from a biomass economy defined as the green economy through the convergence of the biotech industry, the Shells and the Exxons of the world, the Cargills and the ADMs of the world, and the plastic industry all coming together. They tried very hard to define the future on their terms at Rio +20 in 2012 at Rio. And I was so happy to see that it didn't matter what kind of ecologist you were, everyone marched together to say no to the green economy as a corporate takeover of the planet's life. Now, one of the theses of the so-called green economy based on biomass is 75% of the biomass isn't used. No, it's used by nature, in forest catchments, used by women who harvest the fodder, who take a bit of twigs from the forest and light the fire. So the thinking of industry which has brought the mess on GMOs is now they should control the functions of nature, not just what nature produces, not just the land and the trees and the seeds. They should now own the capacity of a tree and its leaves to be able to recycle the carbon dioxide and give out oxygen. That's what REDD is about. It's the function of the forest. And what we're basically saying is not only are ecological functions of nature nature's own, and that's why the rights of nature issue becomes so important, but most of the contributions from nature, the gifts of nature, including those where humanity has worked with nature, are the commons. Seeds and biodiversity are our commons. Our rivers and our lakes are our commons. The atmosphere is our commons. These commons have to be defended for nature's rights and the common good. So you have these two big commons contests taking place. When the British enclosed the commons, or they came here and enclosed the commons of the Native Americans, and the two things were happening at the same time, they basically started a process that is now going to its absurdity. After all, the British started out the insanity by creating the first corporation, the East India Company. And wasn't the Boston Tea Party against something like that? I mean, we had a first independence movement. So what can the law schools do here? I think the law schools need to look a lot at the issue of the commons and common rights, to look at ecological services and functions as part of the commons, as well as the most important work is the work you've already started by limiting the rights of corporations. Because they really feel if they get a crazy idea, they should be allowed to go ahead with it. I mean, there are people right now working with synthetic biology. Glowing plants. Why do you need glowing plants? So you can look at them at night. You know? And in my view, BT crops and HT crops of equal absurdity. And the golden rice, which doesn't compare anywhere with that patwa and that amaranth. It's great. And the GMO banana really takes the cake, because not only does the banana, the banana of course is now being used to give a promise of biofortification. In India with iron enrichment, for Africa with vitamin A. And we've just found, and this on the website of Seed Freedom, the movement for seed freedom, you will find beautiful songs and the campaign that's been launched, because it turns out that the vitamin A in the GMO banana is stolen from a vitamin A rich banana from Micronesia. And the trials, and if other states were like you, what is happening wouldn't be happening. There's a human trial started on GMO bananas in this country, in the state of Iowa. 12 students are being given $900 to eat 3 bananas each. And the reason is, you can't test anything with 3 bananas and 12 people, but what you can say, what you can declare to the Africans is, we've tested it, we've eaten it, now you shove it. And so by next year they'll be telling the Africans to eat this, and it's pirated and there are patents on it. So we've started a campaign against the biopiracy as well as the GMO banana, because we have so many alternatives that produce much more vitamin A, much more iron, and much more of the nutrition. So it is the ultimate desperate resource grab at a planetary level. And all of these resource grabs, land, ecological services, seeds, biodiversity, all of it needs to be looked at as one piece.
Hi, my name is Mimi, and I'm just so overwhelmed and honored to be here listening to you. I've quoted you many times in my own work. I have a question, actually, sort of continuing what you were talking about on the legal aspects. I was wondering, because what I really believe is that what has been going on is that there has been obviously increasing commodification of everything, but humans are being placed in service of and as property of corporations, and corporatism has, is beginning to run amok. And it really extends so much beyond just, well, not just, but it extends beyond agriculture and is intertwined with so many aspects of life. And I sort of looked to California throughout, for many decades, farmers could not get a loan from banks unless they agreed to use pesticides on their crops. And this was the sort of power that corporations have, and I have to assume that we have similar situations going on now with using GMO seeds. But can you think of other ways that we can, legal scholars and students and lawyers can reach out to other areas to look at other innovative ways to stop corporatism. So, for example, what I mentioned about the banks, there's this whole financial aspect of how human laws are being perverted and taken over, and corporations claiming ownership and precedence over anything that's human, claiming that human sovereignty and sovereign laws of nations are subordinate to corporations. So, what other ways can we, maybe in coalition, to stop this?
I would reiterate that the labeling law, as well as the case that's coming out of it because of the challenge, touches on all of those issues that you have addressed. It is, as we call, a litmus test. I think on corporate personhood, yes, we need legal scholarship, but we just need ordinary people to say, no, you're not a person. We need creative artists, we need songs, we need children. Yeah. Do you think a corporation is a person? Like you? No. We just need this to be, they're trying to make this part of popular consciousness. We have to show, we have to let people know that we are an earth family. Rights of nature and human rights are one continuum. And sadly, in that family, corporations don't have a place because they are constructs. And we've got to let constructs belong where they belong, and beings belong where they belong. And this is really an issue of how society at large thinks. And don't forget, it's very beginning, there's one pathetic case in the world called Citizen United, which started all this. And we can't assume that just because there's one Citizen United decision, all of us, 7 billion on this planet, fall in line and say, yes, sir. Yeah? You are the person who governs us and rules us. The image I always have in my head is a dual image. We have to create alternatives, which is why the organic movement is so vital to this time. And I'm so happy that between the time we started at Will's Farm yesterday and then the farm in Burlington, it's young people, particularly young women, who are saying, we create another life out of our choice, and we will shape another future. At the political economic level, it's like doing a bypass. When your arteries are too loaded with stuff that shouldn't belong there, you do a bypass. The political economic arteries are too blocked with corporate power. We need to do a bypass. Politically, democratically, by creating local economies. And all of those ways are available to us. And there are better ways, and it's much more fun to be an organic farmer than to either be enslaved or disposable. Because those are the two options for humanity. Which is why the Occupy movement that my dear friend Jean constantly refers to is so important. Because with that little bit of arithmetic of 1% versus 99%, they woke the world up to the fact that 99% don't matter. But they do. Because, and let me end this response with this. My mind is increasingly working on the fact that we've been given this economic framework with an older illusion. How did corporations get so much power? Because another construct that was made, where money was elevated to capital. And from being a means, which is what money is, capital became a creative force. And now corporations are claiming that creative force unto themselves. But elevating another construction, capital, to the creative force meant removing creativity from real people and nature and reducing them to commodities, land and labor. Decommodifying the earth, which means the rights of nature, decommodifying our creativity, which means get to work with the earth, That is where we have to move now. And there is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but we're part of a movement on the rights of nature in Bolivia. Evo Morales is the one who really triggered the writing of a universal declaration on the rights of Mother Earth. Very important to translate and interpret in our particular context. And you're doing it through your GMO labeling law. It does have that kind of status. Because I know those of you who worked on it know it, that it has that deeper meaning.
I too want to thank you very much for your work and for your courage and for the clarity and self-evidence with which you speak. It's very inspiring. I just want to make a quick comment, which is that Bill Moyers, who was Jimmy Carter's press secretary, was asked whether he felt corporations were people, and his response was, "I will believe that they are people when Texas executes one." I agree completely that we need to construct an alternative to this existing system, and we need to do it quickly. I worry, though, I've heard that farmers in India are beginning to turn away from GMO crops, and I wonder where the non-GMO seed on that scale is going to come from, because the corporations have such a stranglehold on the world's seed supply. And I've also heard that some American farmers in the Midwest are beginning to turn away from GMO seeds, and I worry about the same issue here, that the seed simply won't be available when they need it. So I wonder if you could speak to that for a moment.
You know, what I've learned in my 30 years of seed saving is that one seed can give you 1,000 and 1,000,000. The family of crops which are our crops of love is the millets. We call them forgotten foods that were wiped out of the human diet. The reason these 7 species are called millets is because each seed gives rise to 1,000,000 seed. The word millet comes from million. They're tiny. They have much more nutrition. They use hardly any resources. I had once collected 3 seeds of an old wheat variety from Madhya Pradesh, the central India. We multiplied them. Then the farmers of Punjab wanted old wheat varieties. We gave sackfuls in just a few years. Because all it means is you create networks of farmers who start to grow seed. The beauty of seed is it reproduces, multiplies, and can be shared. Therefore, the idea of scarcity that the Monsantos have created, we should shed it. While we shed corporate personhood, we should shed the idea of where will we get the seed. Just save them and multiply them, and there's enough in the world.
I'd like to thank Dr. Shiva and Will Allen for being here tonight, and all of you as well. Thank you so much, and continue your good work.